Another thing we have to worry about is cognitive decline and neurological conditions. We have pretty clear evidence that leaky gut contributes to neuroinflammation and neurodegeneration. LPS from the gut can actually cross the blood-brain barrier and activate the immune cells in the brain. When these cells are chronically activated, they contribute to neurodegeneration.
What's up and welcome to Sam Miller Science, where you're joining me just over a decade into my personal journey of working to bridge the gap between metabolism, macros, muscle, and medicine, all while helping coaches scale the impact that they desire and deserve. If you are here, thank you so much for listening and for trusting me to help you elevate your coaching game or to lead you in your transformation to realize your true potential. In either case, each week I'll be sharing my methods, models, and message to serve as leverage for your specific goals. Without further ado, let's get on to today's show.
If you've been in the health and fitness space for any reasonable amount of time, you've probably heard the term leaky gut. And with that, you've probably heard people on one end of the spectrum saying it's the root cause of every single health issue that you're experiencing. And then people on the other end of the spectrum who view leaky gut as maybe something that doesn't exist at all or complete hogwash, maybe even calling it a scam. Well, it certainly exists, and there's substantial research to support that, but the truth is it's a little more nuanced than just does it exist or does it not? And we'll discuss that throughout today's episode. Intestinal permeability exists on a spectrum like many health issues, from normal physiological variation to pathological barrier dysfunction. So first, let's start today's episode with what is leaky gut? We'll talk about why it's potentially a bad thing, what can potentially cause it, and then dive into some potential solutions. So the terminology problem related to leaky gut is that leaky gut is really the only unscientific thing about it because it does exist, but in research it's more formally known as increased intestinal permeability, or also called intestinal barrier dysfunction. These are types of terms that you'd see if you were reading a journal or any type of scientific literature, for example. So for educational purposes, I would always say to kind of add that breakdown in terminology, especially if you're explaining it to someone else or with your clients. So if you are going to talk about leaky gut, understand that people realize that it's actual gut barrier dysfunction and inappropriately increased intestinal permeability. Don't just only talk about leaky gut, because I think that leads to more confusion and plays into the hands of those who dismiss it entirely. In order to really quantify or understand leaky gut, we need to be able to differentiate between normal versus pathological permeability. So intestinal permeability is totally normal, and it's not some crazy phenomenon, right? It's something that exists naturally for everyone. This is important to grasp. It's only when it's highly increased and gets completely out of control that it becomes pathological, meaning it starts to impact your health in more negative ways. So first we'll talk a little bit on basic digestion, and you can see where this fits in. So normally food is going to go through digestive processes starting in the mouth with your teeth and saliva, and that's contributing to digestion, absorption, and assimilation. Then it moves to the stomach where it encounters acid and enzymes. From there it goes to the small intestine, which is where absorption actually occurs for the most part. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Some things in food are absorbed by going into or even through the actual intestinal cells themselves. That's called transcellular absorption. But some things are absorbed by going between the cellular space in what we call paracellular absorption. And what we're mainly looking at when we talk about intestinal permeability is this latter pathway, or essentially the space between those cells. There are sets of proteins in between intestinal cells that regulate intestinal permeability very carefully. Think of them as like little gatekeepers, guardians, or almost like little bouncers. So when food is consumed, these tight junction proteins relax a little bit, increasing intestinal permeability ever so slightly so that certain molecules can then be absorbed. And after the absorption is complete, they tighten up again. This is the dynamic, and it's a pretty carefully regulated process that your body has. This normal level of intestinal permeability was actually found and precisely defined by an expert panel in Germany in June of 2012. So it's still pretty recent in terms of having that scientific consensus. It's really happened in the last 14 years or so. During pathologic instances of increased permeability, where it's a problem for our health, this function is deregulated in some way, shape, or form. The space between the cells is open more than it should be, and it's also happening more often than it should. The tight junctions aren't doing their job properly anymore. And this gut barrier dysfunction only really occurs in states where health is a lot less optimal. Things like following a standard American diet, chronic high stress, poor sleep, significantly outtraining your ability to recover, or dealing with metabolic dysfunction. So why is leaky gut potentially a bad thing? The root cause is already problematic, so why could increased permeability be bad or worse? Well, first off, the thing that caused the permeability and caused that function to break down probably isn't doing the rest of the body any favors either in terms of total health. This is an important point that typically gets overlooked. Gut barrier dysfunction only really occurs in states where health is already a lot less than optimal or compromised. So we're not just dealing with an isolated gut issue and playing operation there. We're dealing with systemic health problems that are manifesting in part through compromised gut barrier function. What gets into the bloodstream once increased intestinal permeability does happen, however, things can basically get into circulation where we really don't want them. So I'll give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. So one example could be something like proteins that haven't been fully digested. So if you have increased intestinal permeability, there's a good chance you also have compromised digestion a bit further up the chain as well, whether that's lower stomach acid or maybe less enzyme secretion. This can result in proteins that don't fully break down into their constituent amino acids, which are essentially the building blocks of proteins. So normally these partially digested proteins would pass through the small intestine and either get fermented by large intestine bacteria or pass through your feces. But in the presence of increased intestinal permeability, that's not necessarily the case. These protein fragments can actually get into the bloodstream, and that may activate our immune system. Now, our bodies are used to seeing the individual constituents of these things in the bloodstream, so amino acids, proteins, simple sugars from more complex carbs, and so on. But if a portion of undigested protein makes its way through the gut barrier and into the bloodstream, the immune system basically recognizes it as a foreign invader and attacks it. This causes inflammation, which is really just the activation of the immune system. Now, the body is doing its job, but after a bit of time, the immune system can actually create antibodies to these foods, which is one way that you can develop any type of dietary intolerance or sensitivity to food. You've probably heard of the term food sensitivity, and you've probably known that it's possible to get dietary sensitivities to foods that you eat over and over and over again. So that's one way that this can happen. The good news is that there are what we call false or transient food sensitivities, which will go away once the gut permeability is addressed and the barrier heals. Now, not all dietary sensitivities develop this way, so you may still have some legitimate sensitivities or intolerances that exist even after you address or ameliorate the increased intestinal permeability. So many of the sensitivities that develop through this mechanism are reversible, but obviously, we need to look at this on a case-by-case basis. So another example would be components of bacteria that reside within the intestine. So there's these little pieces of bacterial cell walls called LPS, or lipopolysaccharide, also known in research as endotoxins. In the presence of increased permeability, these will make it from the intestine into the bloodstream in large amounts. And LPS is widely known to be an enormous inducer of inflammation and oxidative stress, which could potentially contribute to numerous chronic diseases developing over time. This is what we call metabolic endotoxemia, having these bacterial components chronically leaking into circulation and then triggering that immune activation that I talked about a little bit earlier on. Now, we do have some long-term health consequences when we're thinking of intestinal permeability. What research indicates as of 2024 to 2026 research updates is that elevated levels of LPS and increased intestinal permeability are present in many conditions. This is where research has recently expanded in recent years. So we'll walk through what we now understand about long-term consequences of chronic intestinal barrier dysfunction. And one of those things is cardiovascular disease and heart health. Because when we look at recent research, there's a pretty strong connection between intestinal permeability and cardiovascular disease. And it's possible because a lot of the root causes of what's causing intestinal permeability isn't super great for cardiovascular health outcomes. A 2024 meta-analysis confirmed that increased intestinal permeability consistently found in CVD patients. And what's particularly compelling is that the biomarkers of intestinal permeability can actually prospectively predict incidence of cardiovascular events, meaning things like strokes or heart attacks, and we might be able to predict it before it actually happens. If you're wondering what the mechanism is, when you have increased intestinal permeability, things like LPS, D-lactate, and TMAO enter the circulation. These compounds accelerate plaque development, and you think about that plaque forming in your arteries, that's going to contribute to those cardiovascular outcomes. Researchers have found intestine-derived bacteria actually present in human plaques. So this is really, really important in our understanding of heart health and long-term outcomes there. The increased Metabolic endotoxemia and the chronic presence of bacterial endotoxin in the blood has been shown to predict cardiovascular mortality. If you are enjoying today's episode and you love learning more about things like gut health, the microbiome, hormones, metabolism, and more, you'll definitely want to make sure you grab a seat in my next workshop in April. I always have the links in the show notes for my upcoming education and free virtual seminars. And you want to make sure if you're a podcast listener and you regularly find value here in these episodes, you'll definitely have to join us live for our April Zoom, diving into our latest topics that we host each and every month as part of our workshop series. If you haven't grabbed your seat yet, be sure to head to the show notes and register. When you insert your name and email, that'll hold your spot, and also make sure you get the invitation to join us live and any following replay access for our latest workshop. I hope to see you in the live session. For now, let's jump back into our episode on intestinal permeability and leaky gut. The mechanism here is that systemic inflammation from bacterial translocation drives plaque formation over time. This contributes to the development and progression of cardiovascular disease. Another problematic condition associated with intestinal permeability is insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. Altered intestinal permeability allows bacteria to come into contact with the immune cells in the gut wall. This triggers increased cytokine production, which directly drives insulin resistance. Enhanced lipopolysaccharides in permeability plays a central role in the chronic inflammation and reduced insulin sensitivity that we often see in type 2 diabetes. There's also a really interesting connection to the microbiome here. Dysbiosis, or that imbalance in gut bacteria, reduces short-chain fatty acid production. And short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, are crucial for maintaining gut barrier integrity. They're also important for the secretion of GLP-1 and GLP-2, which are hormones involved in glucose regulation. So you get this vicious cycle where dysbiosis impairs the gut barrier, which worsens metabolic function, which then further damages the barrier that we had a problem to begin with. What's particularly interesting is that this relationship is bidirectional. Hyperglycemia, or chronic high blood sugar, increases intestinal permeability. So if you already have blood sugar dysregulation, that's going to make your gut health worse. And because your gut barrier is worse, that's making your insulin sensitivity worse, which raises your blood sugar even more. So this becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. The fundamental mechanism is that gut-derived endotoxemia triggers an inflammatory cascade that impairs insulin signaling at the cellular level. Another problem, aside from cardiovascular risk and insulin sensitivity, is liver disease. So from NAFLD to cirrhosis, the gut-liver axis is another area where we're seeing some really compelling research. Small intestinal permeability is significantly increased in both adult and pediatric non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And what's concerning is that permeability increases with the degree of hepatic steatosis, meaning the more fat accumulation you have in the liver, the worse the gut barrier tends to be. The mechanism here involves bacterial translocation and LPS again, driving hepatic inflammation and fibrosis. Essentially, the liver is the first stop for the blood coming from the intestines via the portal vein. So when you have intestinal permeability, the liver is getting bombarded with these different bacterial components and food antigens and inflammatory mediators. Researchers have also found that colonic permeability, not just small intestinal permeability, is elevated in these patients. The gut-liver axis allows translocation of pathogenic bacteria and their metabolites, which induces hepatocyte injury and can progress from simple fatty liver to what's called NASH, so non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and eventually cirrhosis, which is permanent, irreversible scarring of the liver. Another condition we have to watch out for, and I think a lot of our podcast listeners know, is autoimmune diseases in the gut connection. Autoimmune conditions in the gut barrier dysfunction, that's exploded in terms of topic of conversation on social media over the years, but the intestinal barrier enabling bacterial translocation and molecular mimicry, or when bacterial antigens and components of bacteria look similar enough to our own tissue antigens that the immune system gets confused and starts attacking our own tissues, is part of this autoimmune equation. What's particularly interesting is that gut dysbiosis appears to precede the onset in rheumatoid arthritis, suggesting that there's some type of gut joint axis. We're seeing reduced microbial diversity and increased permeability in Sjogren's syndrome, lupus, and multiple sclerosis. In type 1 diabetes specifically, there's a decline in short-chain fatty acid producing microbes and activation of what's called NIRP3 inflammasome, which drives the autoimmune destruction of pancreatic beta cells. The mechanism across these conditions is similar. Bacterial antigens that cross a compromised gut can cross-react with self-antigens, And then the chronic gut inflammation perpetuates systemic autoimmunity. It's like the gut is training the immune system to be hyperreactive. And then that very same hyperreactivity gets directed at the body's own tissues, which is a huge problem. That's the short of it. There's an extensive list of things that happen with immune cell subsets as well, but we're not going to dive into that today just for the sake of time and moving through the episode. Another thing we have to worry about is cognitive decline and neurological conditions. The gut-brain connection is huge when we're talking about intestinal permeability. We have pretty clear evidence that leaky gut contributes to neuroinflammation and neurodegeneration. LPS from the gut can actually cross the blood-brain barrier and activate the immune cells in the brain. When these cells are chronically activated, they contribute to neurodegeneration. Dysbiosis also reduces brain-derived neurotrophic factor production, and BDNF is super important because when this whole thing happens in terms of the gut-brain connection, intestinal permeability, this can impair plasticity, which is crucial for learning, memory, mood, and more. When we see that decline, it's often associated with things like dementia, mood disorders, depression, and anxiety. When researchers compare the gut microbiomes of patients with these conditions to healthy controls, they consistently see alterations. The mechanism of what we call the gut-brain axis dysfunction, where endotoxin-driven neuroinflammation creates a chronic inflammatory state in the brain, it then damages neurons over time. As far as other associated conditions, when we look at the comprehensive list of everything we see when there's elevated LPS and increased intestinal permeability, we have research that covers things like irritable bowel syndrome, IBD, ulcerative colitis is in that category as well, alcoholic and non-alcoholic liver diseases, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, chronic depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, multiple sclerosis, lupus, and even rheumatoid arthritis. We also have things like Sjogren's syndrome, colorectal cancer, and the list honestly just keeps growing and growing as we have more research on the relationship between intestinal barrier dysfunction and these other conditions and kind of looking at the correlation between the two. Sometimes increased intestinal permeability precedes the disease condition and may be part of what triggers it. In other cases, it seems that the condition itself is what might actually be causing the increased permeability. So different timelines there in terms of which came first. The minute details of which comes first hasn't been fully hashed out for many of these conditions. So while we need to go deeper in the research to figure out when there's a causal relationship versus something that's just correlated, we have to remember that intestinal permeability as a concept was formally worked out around 2012. So we've really only had about 14 years of research since then. So this will obviously grow tremendously over the next few decades. Now that we understand what intestinal permeability is and why it's problematic, let's talk about what can actually cause this increased permeability in the first place. A significant amount of things can contribute to pathological permeability, basically the point where intestinal permeability becomes leaky gut and can impact your health and your fitness in your day-to-day life. So one of the biggest ones is going to be psychological stress. So in the podcast, we frequently talk about HPA axis activation, or your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is your stress response system. So here's how this works. If something is coming in dietarily that causes the gut barrier to break down, normally the immune system rushes in to repair things. Your body's constantly doing maintenance and repair on the gut lining. Under chronic stress, though, the immune system is significantly downregulated and shows a shift in behavior in general. So the damage being caused to the intestinal barrier is actually outpacing the immune system's ability to heal it. There are many other ways that stress contributes beyond just immune suppression. So corticotropin-releasing hormone, which is released from the brain during stress as part of your HPA axis response, can directly affect gut barrier integrity. That's been shown on its own. And this has been particularly critical in pediatric IBD development. And we're seeing this in situations of stress in childhood that sets the stage for inflammatory bowel diseases. Poor nutrition is also one of the biggest culprits besides chronic stress. So when we look at poor diet, that is a clear driver of intestinal permeability. So we'll break down some of the dietary factors in today's episode. Processed foods, so hypercaloric foods with low nutrient density, are going to be a huge one, especially things with a ton of additives and emulsifiers and artificial colors, if taken to the extreme, and that's, your primary caloric consumption. These things weren't even in our food supply 50 to 100 years ago. Large boluses of some of these ingredients, or even things like fructose that can be added to food, can increase permeability if consumed in excess. So you'll see things like high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverages. So people who drink full calorie soda, as well as having a lot of hypercaloric, prepackaged and processed snacks and things that aren't necessarily your typical single ingredient whole foods that are micronutrient dense. We're not talking about eating an apple or some berries or fruit. the synthetically added fructose in man-made beverages, are really the problem, not the things you'll find in nature. Now, a single Coke in context, like if someone has a completely healthy diet, it's not like all of a sudden they just immediately develop intestinal permeability. So when people are repeatedly going with a Western diet style and meals that contain large amounts of simple sugars, high dietary fat content, especially relative to protein and more nutrient-dense carbohydrates, that's where it can certainly start to become a problem. Hyperglycemia, or chronic high blood sugar, is one of the most established causes of increased intestinal permeability. So you can see how the poor dietary patterns, Western eating, hypercaloric diets, low micronutrient antioxidant density contribute to this. So this is pretty true across medical literature as well as nutrition studies. As we know, poor diet can result in conditions, metabolic diseases, cardiovascular diseases, and the chronic low-grade inflammation from these conditions can potentially be taking immune system resources away from repairing the gut lining. Gliadin, which is a component of gluten, causes some degree of intestinal permeability in everyone who consumes it, but for some people, it's totally normal and manageable, especially if it's, just consuming gluten in moderation, whereas for others, it becomes more pathological. This is where not everyone is necessarily sensitive to gluten, but some people have a problem to a point where they need to remove it, especially in the case of celiac disease. But then there are some people who don't have celiac who still have some gut issues where it can be problematic from an intestinal permeability perspective. Again, this doesn't mean that no one can consume gluten or that it's bad for everyone, but there are instances where we'll see increased intestinal permeability. Alcohol definitely contributes to leaky gut and intestinal permeability over time. We're not talking about the occasional one glass of wine a week. We're talking about regular overconsumption or binge drinking patterns. Now, in addition to alcohol, there are some other lifestyle, environment, and modern factors. Now, this is new research that's really expanded recently, kind of a developing area of the literature. We're now seeing environmental factors play a bigger role than what we previously understood. So things like nanoparticles, microplastic particles, detergents, air and water quality, food pollution, tobacco smoke, e-cigarettes, and even climate change and ecosystem alterations can contribute to intestinal barrier dysfunction in some form or fashion. Obviously, this is going to be in varying amounts depending on exposure. These are modern environmental exposures that our ancestors never really dealt with, and our bodies are still kind of working through how to handle them when you consider that we're also under chronic stress and have poor dietary quality. Now, moving on to dysbiosis and how it plays a role here. A healthy microbiome is actually a very strong regulator of intestinal permeability, but if that microbiome is not healthy, that becomes a real problem. So a healthy microbiome does a number of things for your gut barrier. The first thing is that a healthy microbiome creates short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, acetate, and propionate, which contribute to that gut mucus layer. This is referred to as mucosa, or the mucosal lining, and it protects the gut from other irritation and things that could potentially cause increased permeability. Some species of bacteria in a healthy gut directly upregulate the amounts of proteins that are responsible for these tight junctions in between the cells. They're literally telling your gut cells to make more of the proteins that keep the barrier tight. There are also an incredibly large amount of metabolites that healthy gut bacteria produce that contribute to a healthy gut lining as well. These are termed postbiotics. So I've done an episode on pre, pro, and postbiotics. So if you're interested in learning more, you can search that in the Sam Miller Science feed on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Now, postbiotics, they're actively maintaining your gut barrier function through the compounds they produce. But when you have dysbiosis, all of this whole entire sort of process or chain starts to break down. Reduced short-chain fatty acid production weakens the mucus layer. Loss of beneficial bacteria then compromises these tight junctions and the regulation of those junctions. Opportunistic pathogens can increase and drive inflammation. And then when we think about what actually triggers dysbiosis, it's usually things like chronic stress, low physical activity, alcohol consumption, antibiotics, and a low fiber diet are all major contributors that we've seen in research. Medications and drugs can also contribute to permeability. So things like nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, steroid medications, oral birth control, Motrin, aspirin, and some other OTC drugs could contribute to intestinal permeability. This is a side effect that a lot of people and common consumers are not necessarily aware of. These medications influence the intestinal barrier and contribute to permeability issues. So in terms of addressing this, if you're someone who kind of abuses Motrin, the aspirin, NSAID family of OTC drugs, it would definitely be a factor to consider. Now, PPIs also kind of go here too, even though it's a different drug class. You may want to talk with your doctor or pharmacist about alternatives and think of things that may be helpful aside from the OTC drugs. Now, antibiotics primarily work through creating dysbiosis, which then affects the barrier. So that's an indirect mechanism, but still important, and another medication that can impact gut health, dysbiosis, and intestinal permeability. Some other risk factors related to this gut health conversation are just going to be chronic inflammation from metabolic disease. If you already have metabolic dysfunction, that systemic inflammation is taking immune resources away from gut repair. Obesity itself has a very similar effect, and we see higher rates of intestinal permeability in obese individuals. Sleep deprivation also contributes to this gut barrier problem, or leaky gut. When we have sleep deprivation, it prevents the nightly repair processes that are supposed to be happening in your gut. So that is going to set us back. Now, if you couple this with things like excess exercise or endurance training, that can compromise gut barrier function further, because now you're just burning the candle at both ends with excess activity and low recoverability. Now, smoking, whether it's traditional cigarettes, e-cigarettes, that tobacco use could be shown to damage intestinal barrier integrity as well. So when you start to think about how to actually address this and how we get rid of increased intestinal permeability, this is something that's going to be well beyond what we can cover in today's podcast episode, since every client deserves a more individualized approach with this, because they may have a different root cause of why they have it. But if I had to give you first order principles, we have to fix the metabolic foundation first and foremost. So if the person that you're working with is obese or overweight or has glycemic dysregulation, you probably shouldn't worry about just only targeting the gut first. This is important, and a lot of people get this wrong because they put people on crazy gut protocols and a ton of supplements when the issue is metabolic dysfunction contributing to the problems related to gut health, and they've really got terrible food quality to begin with. Focusing on their metabolic issues through general lifestyle optimization, things like weight loss, strength training, lots of movement throughout the day, good sleep, reduced stress, all of that can help to actually improve gut health and get rid of intestinal permeability or leaky gut, even without targeting intestinal barrier function specifically. The metabolic issues that the standard American diet creates, combined with insulin resistance, that's really your low-hanging fruit. So when you address those fundamental problems, the gut barrier often heals as consequence without needing any specific gut interventions. Now, not everybody's in this situation. Some people are lean or metabolically healthy, they're not insulin resistant, and they do have gut issues, so that's a little bit of a different story. But if you could imagine my fingers interlaced together, like I'm holding my own hand, like locking my hands together right now, and they slowly spread apart so I can see my fingers. I can see the air or the cracks between those fingers. That is essentially what happens when you have barrier dysfunction over time. When we live an optimized lifestyle, when nutrition is on point after potentially going through a gut protocol, if you're someone who had issues before, when we're sleeping well, we're managing stress, that barrier remains intact. It has integrity. These fingers stay more tightly interlocked. So when we talk about intestinal permeability, the permeability that we're talking about is the gut barrier and the goal to maintain that tight, intact barrier function. Now, if someone's not obese, but you still want to work on their gut health, and you will need to focus on the basics, but we'll talk a little bit about a foundational approach to moving through this. So usually we'll start with minimally processed whole foods. This is the foundation of any good gut intervention. You can't supplement your way out of terrible diet and food choices. This has to be dialed in to improve the gut and intestinal barrier. So talking about real single ingredient whole foods, or things that like your great grandmother would even recognize, not necessarily fast food or a ton of prepackaged ingredients. This is absolutely critical because things like fiber, antioxidants, micronutrients, this helps the gut bacteria, and fiber especially is going to help to produce those short chain fatty acids. You want diversity here, not just only one type of fiber, but ideally if you're getting some fruits, also, maybe you're tolerating some other carbohydrates, root vegetables, different starches that can play into this fiber equation. The third thing we have to look at for intestinal permeability is actually adequate hydration. So water is an essential aspect of the mucus layer and that maintenance. The mucus layer is a physical barrier that protects your intestinal cells, and it needs adequate hydration to function properly. Another one here that might surprise you is actually strength training, because it supports metabolic health and reduces inflammation systemically. When you're strength training and you're moving regularly, you're improving insulin sensitivity, reducing chronic inflammation, and supporting overall metabolic function. Now, you can take this to the extreme. So if you're like CrossFitter doing 2-a-days, Metcons, and strength training, Now, you could get to a point where that's actually contributing to permeability as well. So there's a sweet spot here in terms of dosing. Remember, chronic stress and stress management, as well as managing our exercise and recoverability, is playing into our ability to build a resilient gut and improve that gut barrier function. One of the most important ones that we talked a little bit about earlier in the episode is sleep. If you're not sleeping, you're really not going to be able to improve or repair the status of the gut, period. If you've missed any of my previous podcasts about gut health and you just tuned into the leaky gut episode because it's a catchy title or you wanted to learn about intestinal permeability, you definitely need to go back through the feed in the Sam Miller Science podcast and look at all of the different episodes that we have on gut health, things, whether it's related to bowel movements or bloating or the ability to address inflammation, gut dysbiosis. There's really so much content here. And we even want to consider things like stomach acid status, enzyme production. Gut health is not just a one-sided equation. A lot of people are interested in leaky gut and intestinal permeability, but that's really not the only topic that plays into long-term success. A huge question that I always get, whether I talk about leaky gut on social media or the podcast, is targeted supplementation for leaky gut. So I'm going to include a little section on this inside today's episode. So the first one is zinc carnosine because it supports mucosal integrity. This is a chelated form, or some people say chelated form of zinc that has been shown in research to help repair the gut lining. Slippery elm is another interesting one. It provides things that support the mucus layer, and it's soothing and protective to the gut lining. Marshmallow root is also working as a soothing and protective ingredient, similar to slippery elm. A lot of people like L-glutamine because it's a fuel source for enterocytes, which are your intestinal cells, and it's one of their preferred fuel sources that can support gut barrier repair. Probiotics can be helpful, but they need to be species specific based on the person's individual needs and ideally research strands. Not all probiotics work for everyone, and you want to match the strains to the person's specific situation. Prebiotics support the growth of beneficial bacteria as well. These are like little mini ingredients for the good bacteria that's already in your gut. Now, there are some other ingredients and additional things you can sprinkle in depending on the individual. The supplements you use may depend on if the person's on an elimination diet or not to reduce any type of immune burden, or if any food sensitivities have developed. If someone has small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, you may need to address that specifically because it'll perpetuate intestinal permeability. So that's going to require different supplements than just someone who only is experiencing some intestinal permeability for other reasons. Let's wrap up today's episode with some key takeaways. So this is something you can use if you're looking to improve your own gut health, or if you're a health and fitness coach and you work with clients on their nutrition and improving their digestion. So first, always use proper terminology alongside leaky gut, especially if you're educating other people, whether it's your peers or if you're helping clients or students. Don't just say things like leaky gut and leave it at that. Explain that there are scientific terms like increased intestinal permeability or intestinal barrier dysfunction. I think intestinal barrier dysfunction also helps to explain what's going on in the process. This helps legitimize what you're talking about and bridges the gap between the popular health world and the scientific community and avoid misunderstanding there. The second is understanding that intestinal permeability is evidence-based and there's scientifically valid research and evidence to support it. It's not pseudoscience or woo-woo. There's a substantial amount of research supporting this concept, even dating back to 2012, and it's been growing exponentially ever since. Next, we want to focus on root causes. So things like metabolic health, insulin resistance, stress management, and diet quality before going to the kitchen sink of supplements. Supplements can be helpful, but we don't want to just bring a super soaker to a forest fire. And many coaches who are very uninformed about gut health just throw a random protocol at it. They're buying probiotics and random supplements and antimicrobials, or telling clients to drink these detox drinks that they saw on Instagram, or different greens powders. That's not necessarily addressing the root cause. It doesn't mean all supplements are bad. It just means we still need the lifestyle piece in place. Also recognize that numerous chronic diseases and their connection to intestinal permeability is well established at this point. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, liver disease, autoimmune conditions, neurodegeneration, and even cancer risk. This isn't just about digestive symptoms anymore. Intestinal permeability has systemic effects throughout the body that cannot be ignored. The most effective approach is to address the lifestyle foundations first, and in most cases, you can improve intestinal permeability or leaky gut, even if it's not something you are directly targeting with an advanced protocol specifically, because if you're optimizing lifestyle, stress management, whole food nutrition, strength training in moderation, and you're getting plenty of sleep, intestinal permeability should improve. Finally, remember that gut health impacts so much more than just digestion. It affects performance, hormone regulation, nutrient status, immune function, hydration, and cognitive health. People who have reproductive health concerns, who struggle to build muscle or have compromised immune system, A lot of that does tie back to digestive health. This conversation is going far beyond bowel irregularities. If you're interested in learning more about this topic and more advanced science to help support you as a coach and the clients you work with, I host workshops for health professionals on a regular basis throughout the year, and my latest one is coming up very soon. So if you're interested in the gut microbiota, hormones, metabolism, and these concepts that you'd like to deploy both for your own health and with your clients, I'd encourage you to register for my latest workshop, which you can grab the link in the show notes. You'll enter your name and email, which will send you a live invitation for this virtual seminar. Many of you enjoy the audio from the podcast, but obviously being able to spend time in a live classroom is the best way to address some of these more intermediate to advanced concepts head on and give you a presentation, especially if you're a visual learner. This helps to complement the audio component by having video. So we typically do that in a Zoom environment. This podcast series and even listening to episodes like this on intestinal permeability and leaky gut is a great place to start. But my workshops are about taking these concepts to really the next level and helping to define some of the things that maybe you've heard in podcast episodes or on social media, but maybe you've never actually applied it with your clients. So my goal here is always to give you the ability to bridge the science to application gap, giving you evidence-backed information that you can actually use in a coaching practice as a health professional, as a nutrition professional, and really focusing on the things that are within your scope in order to change a client's life. If you enjoyed today's episode, you learned something new, if it changed your perspective, added value in any way, or you plan to even create some of your own content based on the information I shared here, please support the show by leaving a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other platform. If you're watching on video, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. Hit the thumbs up on YouTube to support us in the algorithm. Help other people who are like-minded find this content so we can share it with the world. Unlike many podcasts, we're not going to bombard you with ads and interruptions throughout your learning experience. We like to jump into the information and give you actionable tools that you can bring back to your life. If you enjoy that, if you find value in that, and if you think other people would benefit, please share the show. You can tag me in your stories. I'm at Sam Miller Science and just about every major platform. Sharing the show on social media or even in a one-on-one text with a friend goes a very long way and is one of the reasons that the show grew tremendously over our first 5 to 6 years of hosting. My team and I truly appreciate each and every rating, every comment, every share, every thumbs up, and every subscriber who tunes into the podcast. Thanks so much for listening today, and I will talk to you guys in the next episode. This show is designed to help you translate complex nutrition, fitness, and physiology concepts into leverage for your clients' goals or your own personal goals. This podcast is for online education, meaning this podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. And no doctor-patient or coach-client relationship is formed through listening to this episode. The use of information in this podcast and the show notes or the reliance on the information provided is done at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and is for educational purposes only. Always consult your physician before beginning any exercise program, and users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such condition. By accessing this podcast and any other episode, the listener acknowledges that the entire contents and design of this podcast are the property of Oracle Athletic Science and should not be used or retransmitted without permission of Oracle Athletic Science. This is protected under U.S. and international copyright and trademark laws. Except as where otherwise provided herein, users of this podcast may save and use the information contained in this podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without prior written permission of Oracle Athletic Science and Sam Miller, which may be requested through the contact information in the show notes. By accessing this podcast, the listener acknowledges that Oracle Athletic Science makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast, and coaches and listeners understand that this information may change over time with different research and anecdotal practices in the field. It is the listener's responsibility to stay up to date on this information. As always, this show is designed to help you, and I appreciate you listening to every episode. Simply understand it's for general informational and educational purposes, and we'll talk to you in the next episode.